Two hospital security guards had their tasers raised and aimed at a snarling, 100-pound military working dog. And the only person standing between them was a 29-year-old ER nurse in blue scrubs who had absolutely no reason to be there. Everyone in that hallway was screaming at her to get back. The dog's teeth were bared. Its eyes were locked on her throat. One wrong move, and that animal would tear through her before anyone could pull a trigger. She didn't flinch. She walked straight toward it. And then something happened that no one in Harlow County Medical Center would ever be able to explain. Something that would unravel every assumption they'd ever made about the quiet woman who showed up for her shifts, kept her head down, and never talked about her past. The dog stopped. It dropped its head, and it pressed its nose gently into her open palm like she was the only person in the world it had ever trusted. If you're watching this for the first time, hit subscribe right now because this channel is where the stories nobody tells finally get told. Don't miss a single one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The shift started like every other Tuesday. Nora Voss clocked in at 6:45 in the morning, grabbed a cup of coffee that was already 3 hours old, and checked the whiteboard. 11 patients waiting in triage, 2 in critical, 1 pending transfer to Stanton Memorial across the county line. She pulled her dark hair back with a rubber band she found in her scrub pocket, drank the bad coffee in 3 swallows, and got moving. That was how she operated. No ceremony, no complaints, just movement. Harlow County Medical Center sat at the edge of Denton Ridge, a mid-sized Colorado city that considered itself the kind of place where things didn't happen, where emergencies were mostly car accidents on Route 9 and the occasional construction injury from the new development going up on the west side of town. The ER was functional, not impressive. The equipment was adequate, the staff was competent, and Nora Voss, who had worked there for 3 years, was considered exactly what she appeared to be, a capable, somewhat reserved nurse who was good at her job and kept largely to herself. Dr. Philip Hart, the senior attending on shift, had once described her to a resident as reliable but not leadership material. He'd said it in the break room while Nora was refilling her water bottle 12 feet away. He hadn't lowered his voice. She hadn't reacted. That was how she operated too. She was treating a 63-year-old with chest tightness in Bay 4 when the radio at the nurse's station crackled. She heard the word security and then the word dog, and then what sounded like something heavy crashing against a wall, and she paused for just half a second that nobody in the room noticed, before she finished wrapping the patient's IV line, told him she'd be back shortly, and stepped out into the hallway. What she saw stopped her in a way nothing had stopped her in years. A man had come through the ambulance bay doors under his own power, which already wasn't right. He was visibly injured, one leg dragging, his face the color of wet concrete. He was big, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his mid-50s, wearing civilian clothes that were several days unwashed. He had the posture of a man who had spent a long time being larger than every room he entered and had never quite learned how to make himself smaller. The dog beside him was on a short lead that the man was barely maintaining. It was a Belgian Malinois, compact, muscular, moving with the coiled spring readiness of an animal that had been trained specifically for violence. Its ears were pinned flat. Its gaze was tracking every person in the vicinity with the systematic efficiency of a security camera. The fur along its spine was raised from its neck all the way to its tail. 2 of Harlow County's security officers had their hands on their tasers. Neither of them had drawn yet, but the posture said they were about 10 seconds away. The man was saying something in a low, tight voice, not to the staff, to the dog, repeating something, a word, or close to one, not quite coherent. The dog wasn't listening. The dog was looking at a triage nurse who had backed herself against the far wall and was now making the specific mistake of maintaining eye contact. "Sir, you need to control that animal," one of the officers started. "I'm trying," the man said. His voice was steady but barely. "She doesn't do well with... She needs a minute to assess the space. She needs to be outside, or she needs to be... She's a medical alert animal." The man's jaw tightened. "She goes where I go." That was when Dr. Hart came around this corner from radiology, took in the situation in approximately 1 second, and immediately made it worse. "Get that animal out of my ER," he said. Not loudly, flatly, in the tone of someone who was accustomed to pronouncements being treated as reality. "Now, before someone gets hurt." Sir, I need medical attention. You'll get it when the dog is secured outside. Those are my conditions. Carlos, he said to the nearest security officer, call animal control. The man's face did something complicated. Not anger, past anger. Something older and quieter than anger. He looked at the dog, and the dog looked at him, and Nora watched the exchange from 15 feet away and understood it with a clarity that made the hair on her arms stand straight up. That animal wasn't aggressive. It was scared. It was doing the only thing it knew how to do when it was scared, which was look like the most dangerous thing in the room. She'd seen it before. She'd seen it in animals, and she'd seen it in people. She set her clipboard down on the nurse's station counter without making a sound and started walking toward them. Voss? The charge nurse, Delia Marsh, caught her arm. Where are you going? To help the patient. Security's handling it. Security's about to tase a retired military working dog, Nora said, not breaking stride. She heard Delia say something behind her but didn't catch the words. She was already moving past the second security officer, who turned toward her with a startled, "Hey!" that she didn't slow down for. She stopped 6 feet from the dog. The animal's attention snapped to her immediately. The growl that came out of it was low and continuous, the kind that doesn't peak because it doesn't need to. It's already a statement of intent. The dog planted its feet. Every line of its body said, "Do not come closer." Nora came closer. "Ma'am," one of the officers said behind her. "Holster your weapon," she said. Quiet, not a request. "Excuse me? If you fire that taser, you will trigger a full defensive response and someone in this hallway will be seriously injured. Holster it and back up. Both of you, back up." There was a pause that lasted about 2 seconds, which felt much longer, and then she heard the officers take a step back. She wasn't sure if it was because they agreed with her or because her tone had been the kind that carries authority by reflex, the kind you obey before your brain catches up to the question of why. She kept her eyes on the dog, not staring it down, not challenging it, just present, steady. The way you exist in a space with an animal that needs to know you're not a threat without being told you're harmless. She let the dog look at her. She let it smell the air between them. She took one more step and went down onto one knee, which brought her closer to the dog's level and made her smaller in the dog's visual field, a body language shift that the animal registered immediately. The growl changed pitch, not softer, but different, questioning. "Easy," she said, and then, very quietly, she said a word. One word. 2 syllables, in a cadence that was not English and not any language most people in that hallway would have recognized. The dog stopped growling. Its ears, which had been flat against its skull, lifted. It took one step toward her, then stopped, reading her face. "Good girl," Nora said, still low, still steady. "Good girl. Come here." And the Malinois walked the remaining 3 feet between them, pressed the side of its face against Nora's open hand, and exhaled. The hallway was completely silent. Nora stroked the dog's head once, twice, feeling the tension in the muscles along its jaw slowly begin to release. She kept her hand moving, kept her voice at that low, even register, kept everything about her as consistent and calm as she could manage, because she knew from experience that the next 90 seconds were the ones that mattered. The window, when an animal that's been running on cortisol and fear either finishes coming down or spikes back up. The dog came down. She heard the man exhale. It sounded like he'd been holding that breath since he walked through the doors. "What in the hell?" someone behind her said. She thought it was Delia. She didn't answer. She looked up at the man, really looked at him for the first time, and registered what she'd only catalogued peripherally before. The wound on his left leg was visible through the tear in his pants. Whatever had happened to it, it hadn't happened today or yesterday. The skin around the edges of the wound was inflamed in the specific pattern of infection that had been left untreated too long. "How long have you had that?" she asked. The man looked at his leg like he'd half forgotten it was there. "A while." That's not an answer. He met her eyes. His were pale, somewhere between gray and green, and they had the particular quality that she recognized, the quality of someone who had learned to assess situations by reflex rather than choice. He looked at her the way she'd looked at him, like he was trying to figure out what he was actually dealing with. 2 weeks, he said. Maybe 2.5. We need to get you into a bay. She stood, keeping one hand resting lightly on the dog's back. She stays with you. That's not possible, Dr. Hart said from behind her. Hospital policy. She's a trained medical alert animal, and he's her handler. Nora turned and looked at Hart directly. Something in her face, or maybe in the fact that she was still completely calm while the rest of the hallway was not, made him stop. Contact the administrator on duty if you want to escalate the policy question. In the meantime, this patient needs a bay, a wound assessment, and cultures. Hart stared at her for a moment that stretched in a way that felt like both of them understood what it meant. Bay 6, he finally said, and that animal does not go near my other patients. Understood, Nora said, and turned back to the man. I'm Nora, she said. I'm your nurse this morning. What's your name? He considered this for a second longer than most people would. Garrett, he said. Marcus Garrett. Okay, Marcus. Can you walk to Bay 6, or do you need a wheelchair? I can walk. He could, barely, and she matched his pace without commenting on it, with the Malinois moving quietly beside her as though it had never made a sound in its life. Bay 6 was at the end of the ER's east corridor, which gave it the most distance from the main patient area and the loudest equipment. Nora hadn't asked for Bay 6 specifically, but she'd known Hart would put them as far away as possible, so she'd named it herself and saved them all the conversation. She got Marcus onto the exam table and began the intake process. His vital signs were concerning but not immediately catastrophic. Blood pressure elevated, heart rate elevated, temperature running just over 102. The wound on his leg was worse than it had looked through his pants. When she cut the fabric away from it, she heard him make a sound that wasn't quite a reaction, more like the suppression of one, and she kept her face neutral and her hand steady. This needs imaging, she said. I want to see how deep it goes and whether there's any foreign material still in there. There is, Marcus said. She looked at him. Shrapnel, he said. The big piece came out years ago. There are smaller fragments. He said it the way you say a fact about something that happened to someone else. They've been there a long time. This, he gestured at the wound, started about a month ago when I was traveling. Traveling from where? A pause. Out of state. Okay. She didn't push. I'm going to start a line and get you on broad-spectrum antibiotics while we wait for cultures. We'll get radiology down here. Has this wound been treated at all in the past 2 weeks? I cleaned it. With what? What I had. She looked at him again. His face was tired in a way that went past the physical, the kind of tired that settles behind the eyes when someone has been operating without backup for too long. You came here alone? She asked. The Malinois, who had positioned herself on the floor directly beside the exam table, lifted her head at something in the question. Marcus reached down without looking and put his hand on the dog's neck. We came together, he said. Nora started the IV. She was good at it, fast, clean, first stick every time. And Marcus didn't react, which told her something about his pain tolerance and also something about what he was used to. What's her name? Nora asked, tilting her head toward the dog. Remy. How long have you had her? 6 years. A beat. She's not mine, technically. She's a retired MWD, military working dog. They retire them, sometimes the handler adopts them, but I wasn't her handler. I took her from... He stopped. I took her when her situation became untenable. Nora hung the antibiotic bag and set the drip rate. She's well trained, she said. The best. Something shifted in his expression. She recognized you. Did she? Before you said whatever you said, she was already changing, the way she looked at you. He watched Nora check the line connection. Where did you learn that command? Nora reached over and adjusted the IV pole. I worked with dogs at one point. That's not a standard civilian command. She met his eyes. No, she said. It's not. The silence between them had weight to it, the specific weight of two people who have each decided to leave something unspoken and are both aware that the other knows it. Marcus looked at her for another moment, then looked down at Remy, then looked back. You're not just a nurse, he said. It wasn't a question. I am a nurse, she said. That's what I am right now, and right now I need to go flag your chart for the attending and request radiology. I'll be back in 10 minutes. She picked up her clipboard. Don't let her eat the blood pressure cuff. He almost smiled. It didn't quite land, but it tried. The hallway outside Bay 6 was not as empty as she'd have preferred. Dr. Hart was waiting, arms crossed, 10 feet from the curtain. Beside him was Sandra Keough, the morning administrator, who had clearly been summoned because someone, probably the security officers, had felt the situation required escalation. "Voss," Hart said. "A word. I need to put in a radiology request." "The radiology request can wait 30 seconds. He stepped slightly to the left, which in the geography of the hallway put himself between her and the nurse's station in a way that was clearly intentional. "You undermine my authority in front of the entire ER. I assessed the situation and acted to prevent a patient from being denied care," she said. "You countermanded my instructions to security. I told security to holster a weapon that would have triggered a full defensive response from a highly trained animal in a hallway full of patients and staff." She kept her voice even. "If I was wrong about the outcome, I was wrong. I wasn't wrong." Hart's jaw moved. "And the dog?" "The dog is a retired military working dog functioning as a medical alert animal for a patient with a qualifying condition. Excluding her would have violated—" "I know what it would have violated, Voss. I don't need you to recite policy at me." He looked at her the way he'd looked at her before, the same calculation. "What I need you to explain is how a bedside nurse knows classified military command words." Nora stopped. Not visibly. Not in any way that anyone watching would have caught. But something behind her sternum shifted, and she felt the specific, familiar sensation of a line being crossed. The line between past and present that she had spent 3 years maintaining very carefully. I wasn't aware I used a classified command," she said. "I Googled it." Sandra Keough spoke for the first time. She was 50, practical, not unkind, and she was looking at Nora with an expression that wasn't accusatory so much as uncertain. "What you said, the phonetics at least, because I couldn't spell it, it matched what I found in an article about Belgian Malinois military training protocol. Specifically, a desensitization and handler recognition command used in—" "Sandra," Nora said, "I've worked with rescue dogs. I pick things up. If that was a classified phrase, I'm not aware that I used it deliberately." She looked at both of them steadily. "Is there anything else, or can I get back to my patient?" A beat. "This conversation isn't finished," Hart said. "It is for right now," she said, and walked to the nurse's station to put in the radiology request. Radiology came in 35 minutes. The films confirmed what Marcus had told her: 3 small metallic fragments in the tissue of his lower left leg, none of them in immediately dangerous proximity to major vessels, all of them surrounded by a spreading soft tissue infection that had moved further than they'd initially estimated. The attending who came down with the radiologist took one look at the images and said they were looking at surgical consultation, minimum. Nora was the one who told Marcus. He took it without visible reaction, which she expected. He asked 2 precise technical questions about the scope of the procedure, which told her something about his background without him needing to say anything. And then he looked at Remy, who was still positioned on the floor at his side, and his face did the thing she'd noticed earlier, that complicated thing that wasn't quite any one emotion. "She'll be here when you come out," Nora said. "I know." He looked up. "Who watches her during?" "I'll arrange it." "That's not in your job description." "A lot of things aren't in my job description." She made a note on his chart. "I'll arrange it." He watched her write. "You were military," he said, not the way he'd said it before, without the questioning edge, just a statement. She kept writing. "The way you moved the security officers," he said, "the way you assessed the room when you walked in, the way you handled Remy." His voice was steady, factual. "And then the command. You were military, and you worked with dogs, and you knew that command because someone taught it to you in a context where commands like that are taught." She finished her note and capped her pen. "I'm your nurse," she said. "That's what I am right now, and it's what matters right now." "It matters to me," Marcus said. Something about the way he said it, not pushing, not demanding, just stating it as plainly as the fact of his wound, made her look at him directly. His face was tired. It had been tired since he walked in. But under the tiredness there was something she recognized, not from the ER, not from this life. From somewhere else. From the specific texture of a person who had been carrying something for a long time and had learned to carry it so consistently they sometimes forgot they were still doing it. She had seen that face in mirrors. "Surgery consult should be here within the hour," she said. "I'll check back in." She left Bay 6. She did her job for the next 40 minutes. She checked on the chest tightness patient in Bay 4, who was stable and irritable about the wait. She started a line on a 14-year-old with severe dehydration from a stomach virus who was frightened and exhausted. She argued briefly and successfully with a pharmacy technician about a dosage that had been flagged incorrectly. She was doing what she always did, moving through the work with a kind of quiet efficiency that the people who worked alongside her had stopped noticing because it had become part of the baseline. She was in the supply room pulling wound care materials when Delia found her. "Hart wants you in his office," Delia said. "When?" "Now it sounds like." Delia's voice was careful. "There's some people out front, Nora. They've been asking at reception." Nora set the materials down. "What kind of people?" "The kind in suits." Delia paused. "And one in uniform." Something moved through Nora's chest. Not quite fear, because she'd trained the fear reflex so far down it barely registered anymore. More like recognition. Like a door she'd thought she'd closed was producing a draft she could feel from down the hallway. "Tell Hart I'll be there in 5, she said. "And don't let anyone into Bay 6 without my clearance." Delia looked at her. "I'm serious, Delia." "Okay," Delia said, quietly. Nora finished pulling the supplies. She took a breath. She checked her watch. It was 11:48 in the morning. Then she went back to Bay 6 first, because she'd said she would. Marcus was sitting up slightly, Remy's chin resting on the edge of the exam table beside his knee. He looked at Nora when she came in, and then he looked at her more carefully, the way he'd been looking at her all morning, like he was calibrating. "Someone's asking for you," he said. "So I hear." She checked the IV bag. Still good. She checked the wound dressing, which Remy watched with the focused attention of an animal who had been through enough medical situations to know that certain movements near her person meant something. "Are you in trouble?" Marcus asked. "I work in an ER. I'm always in trouble about something." She adjusted the drip rate half a notch. "Surgery consult has been pushed by 15 minutes. The surgeon is finishing another case. You're stable, the antibiotics are running, and I've noted in your chart that Remy is not to be removed from the bay under any circumstances. That won't hold up if someone— It will hold up long enough," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You know them," he said. "Whoever's out front." She stopped adjusting the drip rate. "I don't know that," she said. "You went pale when the other nurse told you." He said it without effect. "Just for a second." She looked at him. He looked back. The dog lifted her head from the table edge and turned, pointing her nose toward the curtain, toward the corridor beyond it, in the focused, directional way that working dogs signal when they've registered something before the humans in the room have caught up. Nora heard the footsteps a second later. More than one person, moving with purpose down the east corridor. "I need to go," she said. "Nora." His voice stopped her at the curtain. She looked back. "Whatever it is." He stopped, shook his head slightly, as if he'd decided against whatever he'd been about to say. "Just be straight with them." She stood there for a second, looking at him. "Take care of Remy," she said. And then she stepped through the curtain, and the footsteps were close, and the first thing she saw was the uniform. The kind of uniform she hadn't stood in front of for 3 years. And the face above it was familiar in the specific, unwanted way of someone you'd last seen in a completely different life. She stopped in the center of the hallway. The officer stopped 6 feet away. And the expression on his face was one she couldn't immediately categorize. Not quite relief, not quite urgency. The expression of someone who has found what he was looking for and is not entirely sure yet what it means that he had to look. "Sergeant Voss," he said. The title she'd left behind. The rank she hadn't heard in 3 years, not from anyone who knew what it actually meant, not from anyone who had earned the right to use it. She said nothing. Behind her, through the curtain of Bay 6, she heard Remy make a low sound, not alarmed, not aggressive. Something else. Something that sounded almost like recognition. The officer's name was Callahan. Lieutenant Colonel James Callahan, though the last time Nora had seen him, he'd been a major, and he'd been standing in a field hospital, in a place she didn't think about anymore, telling her that her service record was being classified and her discharge would be processed as medical, and that she should take care of herself. She hadn't spoken to him since. "You look good," he said, which was what people said when they didn't know how to start. "You should have called," she said. "We tried. Your number's been changed twice." That was intentional. He nodded once, as though this was reasonable, which she supposed it was. He had two people with him, a woman in civilian clothes who had the posture of someone who was not a civilian, and a younger man in army green who was trying very hard not to look at the hospital around him like it was strange. None of them were smiling. None of them looked like bad news exactly, but none of them looked like good news either. "Can we speak somewhere private?" Callahan asked. "I'm in the middle of a shift." "I know. I'm sorry. This won't take long." She looked at him for a moment, at the lines in his face that hadn't been there 3 years ago, at the way he was standing, which was the stance of someone who had rehearsed this conversation and was now finding that the rehearsed version wasn't quite right. She made a decision that wasn't really a decision so much as an acknowledgement of the inevitable. "Family consultation room," she said. "Down the hall. Give me 2 minutes." She found Delia at the station, told her she had a family consultation and to watch Bay 6, and walked to the consultation room without looking back at Callahan or his people. She needed the 2 minutes not for anything practical, but to get her breathing right, to find the internal register she'd learned to find in forward operating bases and field hospitals and extraction zones, the place where everything went quiet and she could think clearly without the noise of what she felt getting in the way. She was in the room when they came in. She was standing. She didn't sit, and they didn't ask her to. "There's a situation," Callahan said, closing the door behind him, "involving someone you know." "I don't know anyone anymore," she said. "That was the arrangement." "The arrangement was that your identity and service record would be sealed. It wasn't that you'd be unreachable in an emergency." He paused. "The man in Bay 6, Marcus Garrett." The name landed differently than it should have. She kept her face still. "He's my patient," she said. "He's a former Tier 1 operator who has been off the grid for 11 months, Callahan said. "We've been trying to locate him since March. He dropped his phone, his ID, everything. The only thing we had was an active alert on his dog." "The dog has an alert?" "Remy is a retired military working dog with an embedded tracking chip. When she entered the hospital's vicinity this morning, the alert triggered." He looked at her steadily. "We didn't know you were here, Nora. That part is a coincidence, and I understand it's a significant one, and I'm sorry for it. But we need to speak with Garrett." "He's pending surgical consultation for a wound infection," she said. "He's not in a condition to—" "We're not here to detain him. We're here because there is an active situation that he has material knowledge of, and because there are people who have been trying to find him who are not us." Callahan's voice didn't change pitch, but something in it sharpened. "He's not safe here, Nora. And frankly, neither are you, now that you've been publicly associated with him." She absorbed that. Not visibly, nothing showed, but she absorbed it in the way she'd learned to absorb difficult information in the field, which was to let it sit in the body for a moment before trying to do anything with it. "What situation?" she asked. "I can't brief you fully. You're not—" "I'm currently his primary care nurse, and you're in my hospital telling me my patient has people looking for him who aren't you. Brief me enough to do my job." Callahan looked at the woman in civilian clothes. Something passed between them. "Garrett witnessed something 11 months ago," the woman said. Her voice was careful, precise, the voice of someone accustomed to saying the minimum necessary. "He was debriefed, went quiet, and has been moving since. The people who want to speak with him before we do are motivated to ensure that what he witnessed doesn't reach any formal channel." "Meaning they want to shut him up," Nora said. "That's one way to put it. And Remy's chip led you here, which means it might lead someone else here." "The alert went to a restricted channel," Callahan said. "But restricted doesn't mean impossible to access, and 11 months is a long time for motivated people to develop capabilities." He looked at her directly. "We need to move him. He's pre-op. He has a wound infection that's been running for 2 weeks. You can't move him. We have medical support. You don't have what he needs in the next 8 hours, which is a surgical team in a sterile environment." She held Callahan's gaze. "He stays here. You put security on this building, and you tell me exactly what I'm supposed to watch for, and he gets his surgery and recovers enough to be moved safely." Callahan was quiet for a moment. He glanced at the woman again. 6 hours, the woman said. "We can hold our perimeter for 6 hours confidently. After that, it becomes a more complicated calculation." "Then the surgical team needs to move fast," Nora said. "Which means I need to go push the consult." She moved toward the door. "Nora," Callahan's voice stopped her. "Does he know who you are?" She had her hand on the door frame. He knows I'm his nurse. That's not what I asked. She thought about the way Marcus had looked at her when he'd said you were military, the flat certainty of it, the way Remy had turned toward her the moment she walked into the ER, before she'd done anything, before she'd said a word. Not yet, she said, and went back to work. Bob. She pushed the surgical consult hard enough that the charge surgeon, a compact and efficient woman named Dr. Yemi Adayeze, came down to assess Marcus personally within 20 minutes. Nora stood at the foot of the bed and watched Adayeze work through the examination with the brisk competence of someone who had seen 1,000 wound infections and was already calculating the surgical approach before she'd finished looking. This should have come to us sooner, Adayeze said, not to Marcus specifically, more to the room. Yeah, Marcus said, I know. The fragments aren't in dangerous positions, but the infection's tracking along the fascial plane. We go in, we clean it out, we remove what we can access, and we close. Recovery is going to depend on how well you've been taking care of yourself otherwise. She looked up at him. Have you? A pause. Reasonably. Eat? Sleep? Sometimes. Adayeze made a note. We'll have an OR free in 90 minutes. I want to go then, rather than wait. I need to know my dog is taken care of, Marcus said. She will be, Nora said, before Adayeze could answer or not answer. I'll stay with her. Marcus looked at her. There was something in his face, not quite gratitude, because she got the sense that gratitude wasn't a register he moved through easily, but something adjacent to it, something that acknowledged what she'd said as a real thing, not a platitude. Okay, he said. Adayeze was already moving toward the door. Nora followed her out, and in the corridor the surgeon lowered her voice. What's the security situation? Adayeze asked, tilting her head toward the two figures Nora could see at the end of the hallway. Callahan's younger officer, stationed with the specific studied casualness of someone trying not to look like he was standing guard. Complicated, Nora said. The surgery needs to happen. Everything else works around that. Adayeze looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a surgeon who has spent enough time in high-stakes environments to know when she's being given abbreviated information for a reason, and has made the professional calculation to accept it. 90 minutes, she said, and walked away. Dr. Hart found Nora at the nurse's station 16 minutes later. She had been expecting him, so she didn't look up from the chart she was updating when he stopped beside her. You want to tell me what's happening in this hospital? He said. I'm updating my patient's chart. There are military personnel in my ER. They're in the East Corridor. The ER is functioning normally. Voss. His voice dropped, which was his version of serious. I asked around, about the command you used with the dog. I talked to someone with Army contacts, and they told me that phrase is, they said it's not something that gets taught outside of a very specific training environment, that it's handler restricted. He paused. And then I pulled your file. She stopped typing. Your hire file is clean, he said. Standard nursing credentials. 2 years at a regional hospital in Wyoming before here, references that check out. But before Wyoming, there's a gap. 7 months where you have a forwarding address in Colorado Springs, but no employment record and no history. He paused. I'm not accusing you of anything. I want to understand what I'm dealing with. She turned and looked at him directly. You're dealing with a nurse who is good at her job. You're dealing with a patient who needs surgery in 90 minutes. And you're dealing with a security situation that the military is managing, which means it is not your responsibility and you don't need to know the details. She picked up her clipboard. What else? I want you off the Garrett case. The statement sat between them. No, she said. Excuse me. He's my patient. I know his history, I have his trust, and his dog has been calm since I established contact. You pull me off this case and you'll spend the next hour managing a stressed animal in a hospital bay while your surgical prep falls apart. She kept her voice flat. Is there a clinical reason to remove me from the case, Dr. Hart? Because if the answer is no, then what you're doing is a management decision you can make. But I want you to be clear with yourself that you'd be making it for personal reasons and not medical ones. His jaw tightened. This isn't over. It very rarely is, she said, and walked away from him. She spent the 40 minutes before Marcus's surgery doing 3 things. She completed the chart, which needed to be airtight. She coordinated with Callahan's team about the logistics of the OR waiting area and where Remy could be secured in a way that was safe for the dog and unobtrusive for the hospital. And she sat for 10 minutes in Bay 6, not doing anything clinical, just present, Remy's head in her lap, Marcus watching the ceiling with the particular stillness of a person who is preparing for something and doing it alone. "Tell me something," he said out of nowhere. She waited. "The command." He turned his head to look at her. "Where did you actually learn it?" She stroked Remy's ears. The dog's eyes were half closed, the specific heavy-lidded comfort of an animal that has finally decided it's safe to let its guard down. "Ghazni Province," she said. 2019. She said it before she'd fully decided to. It came out in the same flat register as the fact of his shrapnel, just a thing that was true, offered without decoration. Marcus was still for a moment, then, "You were there." "Not in Ghazni specifically, in the region. I was attached to a forward surgical team. We were embedded with a mixed unit for about 4 months. She looked down at Remy. There was a handler. His dog was injured in a breach, took fragmentation to the shoulder. She came to us because the handler wouldn't leave her with the regular vet staff. He said she'd shut down without someone who knew the protocols. A pause. I spent 2 weeks learning every command he used so she'd let me treat the wound. What was the handler's name? Something in his voice had shifted. Not urgency, exactly. Something more careful than that. Reyes, she said. Danny Reyes. The silence that followed was different from the silences before it. Marcus, she said. He had both hands flat on the exam table, and he was looking at the ceiling again, and his face was doing that complicated thing, more complicated now than before, pulled in more directions at once. You knew him, she said. Not a question. He was in my unit, Marcus said, for 2 years. A long pause. He didn't make it home. Nora's hand stayed steady on the dog. I know, she said. I heard later. I'm sorry. He talked about the surgical team. Marcus's voice was even, effortful. He said there was a nurse who sat with Kira, that was his dog then, for hours. Just sat with her. Said it was the only reason Kira pulled through. He looked at Nora. He called you the dog whisperer. He didn't know your name. The fluorescent light above them hummed at its usual frequency. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeped a routine alarm and was silenced. I didn't know his name either, she said. Not his full name. We weren't supposed to. There were protocols about what identifying information we exchanged. Yeah. A breath. There were a lot of protocols. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the thing that passed between them was not sentimental and it was not simple. It was the particular acknowledgement of 2 people who had been in the same war at different angles and had survived it with different kinds of damage, and who were sitting now in a hospital bay in Colorado with a dog named Remy who had belonged to someone else and who was still, somehow, connecting the threads. She's Kira's daughter, Marcus said. Remy, same line, same handler lineage. When Reyes was KIA, Kira was retired. She had a litter 2 months later. He reached down and touched Remy's flank. I took Remy when the program she was in fell through. It felt like... He stopped. It felt like the right thing to do. It was, Nora said. Remy shifted slightly, pressing closer against Nora's leg, and the 3 of them were quiet in the small space of Bay 6, while the hospital moved around them. What? The orderly came for Marcus at 12:58. Remy watched the process of the gurney transfer with the focused, unhappy attention of a dog who understood what a gurney meant and didn't like it. And Nora kept one hand on the dog's collar and talked to her steadily and quietly in the command language while Marcus was wheeled out. And it was only when the gurney turned the corner toward the OR corridor that Remy let out a single low sound, not a bark, not a whine, something between, and then stood very still. He'll come back, Nora told her. He'll come back. The dog looked at her with eyes that were too intelligent for the comfort that statement was meant to provide. The next 3 hours were the hardest kind of waiting, the kind that doesn't look like waiting from the outside because there was work to fill it with. But that had an undercurrent to everything, a frequency running beneath every other task that she couldn't turn off. She moved through her remaining patients. She checked on the dehydrated teenager who was rehydrating well and had stopped being frightened and started being bored, which was the right direction. She completed 2 admissions. She handled a visiting family who were angry about wait times with the specific, measured patience she'd developed for situations where the anger was actually fear and needed acknowledgement before information. She kept Remy in the small staff corridor behind the East Bay, which was quiet and away from the main patient flow. The dog had settled into a watchful stillness, not relaxed, but controlled. Every time Nora came back to check on her, Remy stood, assessed her, and then sat back down, maintaining her vigil with a consistency that Nora found both heartbreaking and quietly impressive. Callahan came to find her at 2:15. "The OR is taking longer than projected," he said, in the low, direct tone she remembered from briefings. "Infections are unpredictable. ADES is thorough." "That's fine. The surgical outcome is fine." He paused. "We have a complication." She looked at him. "Someone made inquiries at reception 40 minutes ago. Patient named Marcus Garrett, asking to confirm his presence in the facility. The receptionist didn't confirm, followed protocol, but the inquiry was made." He kept his voice measured. "My people ran the contact number the inquiry came from. It's a burned phone, which means... It means they're already here," she said, "or close. We don't know proximity. We know they're checking locations." He rubbed the back of his neck, a small human gesture she'd never seen him make before. "I've added 2 people to the corridor outside OR. Once Garrett is out of surgery, we move him to a secure recovery location as fast as medically feasible. He needs at least 4 hours post-op before transport. We're working with what we have." "What do you need from me?" Callahan looked at her for a moment, the kind of look that was making a decision about something. "Keep doing exactly what you're doing," he said. "You're the reason that dog is calm, and the reason that patient went into surgery with a baseline of trust in this facility. That matters more than you might think." He paused. "And if anything in this building looks wrong to you, anything that doesn't fit, you call me directly. Not security, not administration, me." He gave her his card. She put it in her scrub pocket without looking at it. After he left, she stood for a moment in the staff corridor with Remy, who had watched the exchange with the dog's version of careful attention. "I know," Nora said, to no one in particular. Remy stood up and pressed her forehead against Nora's thigh. Hart caught her again at 3 o'clock, and this time he had Sandra Kioff with him, and the expression on Sandra's face was the expression of an administrator who had been pushed into a corner and had decided to stop being reasonable about it. "I've been on the phone with the hospital board's legal liaison," Sandra said. "Given the nature of the military involvement and the questions it raises about your background and credentials, we're placing you on administrative oversight for the remainder of your shift." Nora looked at her. "What does that mean practically?" "It means Dr. Hart will review all your clinical decisions in real time. It means you don't act independently on the Garrett case or any other case without his sign-off." "That's not oversight," Nora said. "That's supervision without cause." "It's precautionary," Sandra said. "It'll slow down patient care." "That's a risk we're accepting." Nora looked at Hart, who was looking at a point slightly to the left of her face, the look of someone who has gotten what he wanted and is trying to appear neutral about it. "Is there a clinical complaint against me?" she asked. "Has any patient outcome been compromised?" "This isn't about patient outcomes." "Then what is it about, Sandra? Be specific." Sandra's chin came up slightly. "It's about a nurse who knows classified military information, who has unexplained gaps in her employment history, and who is now at the center of a situation involving military personnel that has disrupted this hospital's operations. We have a responsibility to our patients and our staff to ensure that everyone operating in this building is who they say they are." The corridor was quiet except for the distant sound of the hospital working. "Fine," Nora said. "Put it in writing and have it on file before end of shift. And put in writing that this oversight was implemented on the same day that my patient, a man with a serious wound infection, required surgical intervention because I want that timeline documented." She held Sandra's gaze. "Is there anything else?" There wasn't. She walked back toward Remy's station, and she was almost there when she heard it, a sound that didn't fit. Not an alarm, not a shout. Smaller than that. A door at the far end of the east corridor, the service entrance that the maintenance staff used, opening and closing with a click that was too deliberate, too careful. The sound of someone who was trying not to be heard rather than someone who simply wasn't thinking about it. She stopped. She stood very still and listened. Remy had already turned toward the sound. Every line of the dog's body had shifted, not into aggression, but into the specific, coiled readiness of an animal that has recognized a threat before the humans in the room have caught up. Nora's hand went to her scrub pocket. Callahan's card. Not security. Him. Her phone was already in her other hand. She was dialing when the second sound came. Boots on linoleum, moving fast and not carefully anymore, and the service entrance door swinging open again with a force that sent it back against the wall, and a figure she didn't recognize coming through it with the specific, purposeful momentum of someone who had made a decision they weren't going to unmake. Remy hit the end of her lead and held. Nora hit send on the call and moved her body between the dog and the corridor, not because she'd decided to, not because it was the smart tactical choice, but because some responses are older than decisions, and her body was already doing it before her mind had finished the sentence. The figure stopped. They looked at each other across 15 feet of linoleum. The figure was a man she'd never seen, mid-30s, civilian clothes, the posture that wasn't quite military, but had been near it long enough to pick up the stance. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized, the expression of someone who has arrived expecting one scenario and found another. He hadn't expected her. He hadn't expected the dog. And he hadn't expected the sound of the phone connecting and the voice on the other end saying Callahan in a clipped, immediate way that carried clearly in the quiet of the corridor. East service entrance, Nora said, not taking her eyes off the man. Now. The man in the corridor didn't run. That was the first thing Nora registered, that he didn't bolt when he heard Callahan's voice on the phone, which meant he was either disciplined enough to hold position under pressure or calculating fast enough to know that running would immediately define what he was. He stood, hands visible, and looked at her with an expression that had gone carefully neutral, the specific blankness of someone who has a cover story and is deciding how much of it to use. I'm looking for the pharmacy, he said. The pharmacy is in the main building. This is the restricted east corridor. She kept her voice level and her body between him and the direction of the OR. How did you get through that door? It was open. It hadn't been. She'd heard it click. Behind her, Remy was holding, not barking, not lunging, just positioned with that coiled stillness that was in some ways more alarming than aggression because it communicated control. Trained control. The dog was waiting for a signal that Nora hadn't given, and the man's eyes had gone to Remy once and come back to Nora with a slight recalibration in them. Callahan's voice on the phone. 2 minutes. I have a visitor in the east corridor who entered through the service entrance, Nora said, not to the man, not breaking eye contact with him. He says it was open. Hold position, Callahan said. The man's jaw moved slightly. He was processing, running some version of the math that all people in his situation run, which is the calculation between what you came to do and what you can still do given what has changed. The phone, the dog, the woman who hadn't moved an inch. Look, he said, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I think so too, Nora said. I think you misunderstood how quickly this corridor would be covered once I made that call. So now we wait. He looked at her. She looked at him. Remy's ears tracked every small sound in the corridor with the precision of instruments. Callahan's people arrived in 90 seconds, not 2 minutes, which meant they'd already been moving before she called, already repositioning based on the earlier inquiry at reception. 2 of them came from the main corridor end, one from a side door she hadn't known connected to this section of the building. The man assessed his options in the approximately 4 seconds it took for that geometry to become clear, and then he put his hands up. Not dramatically, practically. The gesture of someone who is making a specific calculation about which version of this situation is more survivable. I just want to talk to someone, he said. You'll get to, said Callahan's female officer, who had appeared from the side door. Come with us. Nora stepped back, giving them the corridor. Remy remained at her side, taut and watching, until the man was out of the corridor and the door at the main end closed behind all 3 of Callahan's people and their new companion. The east corridor was suddenly very quiet. Nora stood in it for a moment, one hand on Remy's back, and let the adrenaline do what it was going to do, which was move through her system like weather, fast and impersonal, just the body doing its accounting. She'd learned a long time ago not to fight it and not to indulge it. You felt it, and you kept moving. She checked her watch. Marcus had been in surgery for 2 hours and 11 minutes. Ariz had estimated 90 minutes to 2.5 hours, depending on what they found when they got in. She went to check on her other patients. Ariz came out of the OR at 4:22. Nora was at the nurse's station when she appeared at the end of the corridor, still in her surgical cap, pulling her gloves off with the efficient strip and fold of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. Her face was the post-surgical face, not relieved, not concerned, somewhere in the careful middle ground of a surgeon who has done the job and is now conducting the forensic accounting of it. "He's in recovery," Arias said, stopping at the station. "We got 2 fragments. Third one is too close to the posterior tibial artery to touch without more imaging and a vascular surgeon. I flagged it, it's stable, it's been there a while, and it'll keep. The infection was worse than the film suggested." She paused. "He's going to be sore. He's going to need IV antibiotics for the next 72 hours minimum, and someone needs to make sure he actually rests, which I suspect is going to be the hardest part of his recovery." "Can he be moved?" Arias looked at her. "By moved, are we talking down the hall, or further than that?" A pause. "Not tonight. Not safely. 8 hours minimum post-op before I'd want him in any kind of vehicle, and that's with optimal post-surgical management." She looked at Nora steadily. "Is this related to the people in suits who've been standing in my hospital for the last 4 hours?" "Yes." "Okay." Arias didn't ask anything else, which was its own form of professional competence. "He's asking for the dog." "I know," Nora said. "I'll bring her." Okay. Recovery room C was small and smelled like antiseptic and the particular metallic quality of recycled hospital air. Marcus was in the bed closest to the window, which was small and frosted and let in a rectangle of afternoon light that was already going orange at the edges. I was awake. Not fully, the way people in the first hour post-anesthesia are not fully awake, consciousness arriving in layers with gaps between them. But his eyes were open and tracking when Nora came in with Remy on the lead. The dog saw him, and the control she'd been maintaining for the last 3 hours dissolved in a way that Nora found unexpectedly affecting. Remy didn't bark, didn't jump, just covered the distance to the bed in 2 steps and put her head on the mattress beside his hand with an urgency that was completely stripped of the trained composure she'd held all afternoon. Just an animal who had been worried and was now, for the first time since morning, not worried. Marcus's hand moved onto her head. His eyes closed briefly. "Hey," he said. To the dog, not to Nora. Nora stayed near the door and gave them the moment. She was aware of the 2 military personnel in the corridor outside, visible through the small window in the recovery room door, stationed with the practiced invisibility of people who are trying to look like hospital staff and not quite managing it. When Marcus's eyes came back to her, they were clearer. "They found someone," he said. "Not a question. In the east corridor, your service entrance." She moved to the chart at the foot of his bed and checked the recovery notes. "He's being held. I don't know what happens next with that. That's not my lane." "Callahan," Marcus said. "Yes." He exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled, the deliberate breath of someone managing pain without showing it. "How many?" "One that we saw." "That's not how they operate." His eyes went to the frosted window. "One is the one you see." Nora looked at him. He was right, and they both knew he was right, and the weight of that knowledge without needing elaboration. "Ariz says you need 8 hours before transport," she said. "Callahan's working with that." "And the hospital?" "Is being managed." She set the chart down. "You need to rest. I need to be debriefed. You need to let the anesthesia finish clearing your system before you do anything that requires a functioning prefrontal cortex." She looked at him directly. "Whatever you know, you'll know better in 4 hours. Rest." He looked at her for a long moment. Something about the look was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the surgery, the tiredness of a person who has been the one holding information that no one else wants responsibility for longer than is good for any person. "Danny Reyes," he said. "You said you knew him." "I did." "He trusted people carefully." A pause. "He said the nurse who sat with Kira was the kind of person who doesn't make noise about what they're capable of." "He barely knew me." "He knew enough." Marcus shifted slightly, grimaced at what that cost him, and settled. "He would have liked that you're here." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Sleep," she said. I'll be close. She was not supposed to be the one managing his post-op care. Under the administrative oversight Sandra Kieff had imposed, she was not supposed to be making independent clinical decisions on this case at all. Hart had made that clear in a brief, tight exchange at the nurse's station at 4 o'clock, during which he had told her he was reassigning Marcus's case to a nurse named Pavel Dowd, who was competent and blameless and had absolutely no context for the situation in that room. She had listened to Hart and said, "Okay," and then she had taken Remy to recovery anyway, because the clinical reality was that Remy's presence directly affected Marcus's post-op stress response and cardiovascular stability, and removing the dog would have created a measurable clinical problem that Pavel Dowd was not equipped to manage. She had documented all of this in Marcus's chart with the specific, detailed precision of someone who is making sure every decision is on record. If Hart wanted to make an issue of it, the chart would tell the story clearly. She was back at the nurse's station at 5:15 when Callahan appeared at the end of the corridor, moving fast. Not running, but the accelerated walk of someone who has received information and is already acting on it. "We have a problem," he said, reaching her. "Another one." The man from the corridor, he wasn't working alone, which we expected. What we didn't expect is how many. He dropped his voice. "We've identified 2 vehicles in the parking structure. Confirmed occupants, confirmed surveillance of the building exits." He looked at her steadily. "They're not here to ask questions. They're here to make sure Garrett doesn't leave this building in any condition to testify." The word testify landed with a clarity that reorganized the entire architecture of the day. "He's pre-deposition," she said. "Whatever he saw, he's been called to give formal testimony. Scheduled for 6 days from now. Federal Oversight Committee, closed session." Callahan's voice was even, but underneath it there was the controlled tension of a person managing a situation that is larger than the resources currently available to manage it. "We have 3 people in this building. We have backup requesting expedited deployment, but that's 2 hours out, minimum. And in 2 hours, the people in the parking structure may decide that waiting is a worse option than moving." Nora thought for 3 seconds, which was enough. "Alternate exit. Not the ambulance bay, not the main entrance, not the service entrance they already accessed. There's a loading dock on the building's south face. It connects to the hospital's laundry and supply operation. It doesn't appear on the standard facility map because it's a maintenance-only access point." She paused. "Can you get a vehicle to the south face of the building without it being visible from the parking structure?" Callahan pulled out his phone. "Depends on the approach. Show me." She drew it from memory, the hospital's layout, the access roads, the sight lines from the parking structure based on where she'd seen it positioned when she arrived for morning shifts. It was not a perfect map. It was a nurse's working memory of a building she'd moved through for 3 years, which included the kind of spatial detail that accumulates when you're moving fast through a space every day and paying attention even when you don't think you are. Callahan looked at it. He looked at her. "How do you know the sightlines from the parking structure?" "I walked in from there every morning for 6 months before I switched to street parking," she said. "Can you get a vehicle there?" "Possibly." He was already typing. "Garrett needs to be mobile enough to reach the south loading dock. He's post-op 4 hours when you'd want to move. He'll be mobile. He won't like it and it'll cost him, but he'll be mobile." She paused. "Remy needs to be with him. Non-negotiable." "Understood. And I need to know if there are people inside this building who aren't the man from the corridor. Because if there are and we don't know where they are, moving Garrett through internal corridors is—" "I know," Callahan said. "We're working on that." "Work faster," she said, which was not a thing she'd have said to a lieutenant colonel in a different context, and which Callahan received without visible reaction because the context made it the right call, and they both understood that. At 5:45, Hart suspended her. Not fired, he was careful about the word, but suspended from clinical duties pending the administrative review that Sandra had been building toward all afternoon. He came to the nurse's station with Sandra and a written notice and the expression of a man who has convinced himself that what he's doing is reasonable. "You've been operating outside the oversight parameters established at 3 o'clock, he said. "You've entered the recovery room independently, you've been interfering with security operations, and you've been providing information to military personnel without authorization from hospital administration." "I've been providing information about hospital layout," she said, "to ensure my patient's safety." "Your patient," he said, with a specific inflection that made the words mean something else. is not your patient. He was reassigned at 4 o'clock. His dog knows me. His post-op presentation has been complicated by the stress of the security situation, which I am one of the few people in this building equipped to help manage. Pulling me from this case is done, Hart said. It's done, Voss. Go home. She looked at him, at the written notice in his hand, at Sandra, who was looking at the middle distance between them with the expression of someone who has made a bureaucratic decision and is committing to it. Put it in writing, she said. Every word. What time it happened, the clinical status of the patient at the time of my removal, and the name of the person making the decision. I want it all documented. It will be, Sandra said. Good. She took the notice from Hart's hand, folded it once, and put it in her scrub pocket next to Callahan's card. Then I'll be in the recovery corridor. I just told you, you suspended me from clinical duties. I can still be in the building. She looked at him. Unless you're telling me to leave the premises entirely, which is a different order and requires different documentation. The silence stretched. Get out of my ER, Hart said. I'm in the recovery wing, she said, which is a different department. And she walked away from him before he could respond, which was not professional and not something she'd normally do, and which felt, in the specific calculus of this specific moment, like the only correct choice available to her. She was in the corridor outside Recovery Room C when it went wrong. Not the way she'd been anticipating, not from the parking structure, not through another service entrance. It went wrong in the way things go wrong in hospitals, which is through the inside, through the systems, through the people who are supposed to be where they are and suddenly aren't. The monitor alarm in Recovery Room C sounded at 6:03. Not Marcus's monitor, the room's general alert, which meant something environmental had triggered it. She was through the door in 2 seconds. The room was exactly as she'd left it, except for one thing, the window. The frosted glass of the recovery room window, which she'd noted was small and appeared fixed, was not fixed. There was a latch mechanism she hadn't seen, and the window was open 3 inches, and Remy was at the window with her entire body oriented toward it, vibrating with the controlled intensity of an animal that has detected something on the other side. Marcus was awake and sitting up, which he absolutely should not have been. Get down, Nora said, moving across the room. There's someone on the exterior ledge, he said. His voice was tight with the effort of being upright post-surgery, but it was clear. Remy's been on it for 2 minutes. I triggered the environmental alert. She was already at the window. She could hear it now, movement on the narrow service ledge that ran along the outside of the building at this level, which she had also not known was there, and which suggested that the person currently on it had done more thorough reconnaissance of the building than she'd had time to do. How far to the corner? She said. Maybe 15 feet. He was watching her assess the window. They're moving toward the exterior junction box. If they get into the building's electrical panel, they take out the backup power and the internal cameras go dark, she finished, which was when she understood the full shape of it. The man in the corridor had not been an attempt to reach Marcus. He had been a distraction. He'd been the visible piece, the one they'd expected her to react to, while the actual approach was being set from the outside. She grabbed her phone and hit Callahan's number. It rang twice. East Recovery Wing exterior, she said when he picked up. Service ledge moving toward the junction box. If they get to it... I see it, Callahan said. We have visual from the roof. We're moving. How long? 2 minutes. She looked at Marcus. He was sitting up against the headboard with the fixed attention of a man who is in pain and ignoring it completely, watching her with eyes that were running the same tactical calculation she was. Remy was still at the window, still vibrating, still waiting. 1 minute, maybe less. Get down, she said to Marcus, and stay down and do not move until I tell you. What are you... She went to the window and pulled it closed, latched it, pulled the privacy curtain across. Then she turned off the room light, which plunged the space into the dim secondary light of the corridor glow coming under the door, and she moved to the corner of the room that put the bed in the wall between her and the window. 20 seconds of silence. Remy left the window and came to her, pressed against her leg. Every hair on the dog's body was still raised. Then footsteps on the ledge, close, deliberate, slowing as they reached the window. A pause. The latch rattled, once, twice. Nora held completely still. The rattle stopped. 30 seconds of nothing. Then, from outside, a shout. Callahan's people. On the ledge from the roof access. closing the distance in a way that apparently made further progress on the outside of the building an unviable option. A scramble of movement. A sound that was not quite a fall but was close to one. Someone catching themselves on the ledge, losing ground, making a controlled descent rather than a continuation. And then nothing. Nora let out a breath that she hadn't been aware she was holding. The lights came back up. She turned them on herself because standing in the dark with the adrenaline ebbing was not useful to anyone. She checked Marcus, still upright, still against the headboard, watching her with that expression she'd seen several times now and was beginning to understand was simply how his face looked when he was paying complete attention. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I'm fine." He wasn't, clinically. His blood pressure would be elevated from the exertion of sitting up. His wound would be protesting. And there was a particular tightness around his eyes that meant his pain management was being outrun by the events of the last 5 minutes. "Are you?" She considered the question. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was normal. She was tired in a way that went several layers deep, and she was aware that the administrative suspension in her scrub pocket was going to become a real problem in the next 24 hours. And she was aware that the situation outside this building was not resolved by 2 people being detained, and she was aware that somewhere in this hospital there were people making decisions about her that she wasn't going to be consulted about. "I'm okay," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You know this doesn't stop here." "I know. When I testify, whatever I saw, whatever it exposes, the people who don't want that to happen are patient. They'll keep trying." "I know that too." "You shouldn't be in the middle of it. You left this life. You had reasons." She looked at him steadily. "I'm a nurse in a hospital, and you're my patient," she said. "That's what this is. The rest of it is what it is." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Reyes would have trusted you," he said, "not because of the dog, because of how you stayed." She didn't answer that. She went to his chart and checked his stats, which had been automatically updated by the monitoring equipment, and showed exactly what she'd expected. Blood pressure spiked, heart rate elevated, oxygen saturation slightly dipped from the effort of being upright. "Lie down," she said. "Now, before Adayas comes in and has opinions." He lay down. It cost him, she could see it cost him, but he did it without complaint, which was its own kind of stubborn professionalism. Remy moved back to the bedside and resumed her position with her head on the mattress's edge. Nora was making a note in the chart when her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was Callahan. A text, 4 words. "Check the security footage." She stared at it. Then she looked at Marcus, who had his eyes closed and was managing his breathing in the deliberate way of someone trying to will their body towards something approaching calm. Then she looked at the door of Recovery Room C, beyond which the corridor was lit and ordinary, and the hospital was doing what hospitals do, which is continue regardless of what happens inside any individual room. She went out into the corridor and found Callahan standing 20 feet away with his phone extended, showing her a still from the hospital's internal camera system, the main corridor, outside the ER, approximately 40 minutes ago. A man and a woman moving through the hospital in scrubs. Standard Harlow County scrubs, the right color, the right cut, moving with the purposeful ease of staff who belonged there. Nora looked at the still for a long moment. She recognized the scrubs. She recognized the corridor. She did not recognize either face. "How did they get the scrubs?" she said. "That's what we're trying to determine," Callahan said. "But Nora," he pointed at the timestamp on the image. "This is from 40 minutes ago, which means they're still in the building." She looked up from the phone. The corridor in front of her was empty. The corridor behind her was empty. The lights were their usual fluorescent white, and the monitors were doing their usual work, and somewhere a door opened and closed, and the hospital breathed on around her. 2 people in the building, in Harlow County scrubs, moving like they knew where they were going. She looked back at Recovery Room C's door, and the monitor inside Marcus's monitor began to alarm. She was back through the door before the alarm completed its second cycle. Marcus was awake, had not stopped being awake, but his left arm was extended toward the IV pole in a way that told her immediately what had happened. The main line had been disturbed. Not pulled, not kinked, but the flow rate on the pump was reading differently than she'd set it, which meant someone had adjusted it, which meant someone had been in this room while she was standing 20 feet away in the corridor looking at a photograph on Callahan's phone. She crossed to the pump in 4 steps and silenced the alarm manually, then checked the line from the insertion point at his arm to the bag overhead. The antibiotic bag was intact. The saline was intact. The pump settings had been changed. The rate slowed to a level that wasn't immediately dangerous but would, over several hours, result in subtherapeutic antibiotic delivery and fluid deficiency. "Someone was in here," Marcus said. "How long ago?" "Maybe 3 minutes. I was drifting. Remy woke me up." Remy was at the room's secondary door. The door in the room's far corner that connected to an internal service corridor she hadn't noticed on her first assessment because it was flush with the wall and painted the same institutional beige. It was closed. The dog was standing directly in front of it with the focused, still orientation that meant whoever had been in this room had gone that way. Nora reset the pump rate and checked Marcus's vitals on the monitor. His blood pressure was up again, heart rate elevated. The compound effect of surgery, inadequate post-op rest, and whatever his nervous system was doing in response to knowing someone had been close enough to touch his IV line while he was semi-conscious. "Are you in pain?" she asked. "Yes." "Scale." 6. A pause. "Maybe 7. "Okay." She looked at the secondary door, looked at Remy. "Don't move. Don't touch the line. I'm going to get Callahan." "Don't go through that door alone." "I'm not going through the door. I'm going to the corridor." She held his gaze for 1 second. "I'll be back in 90 seconds. She was back in 60, Callahan behind her, the female officer, whose name she'd learned was Torres, behind him. Callahan looked at the secondary door, looked at Remy's position, looked at Nora. "Building schematic," he said. "That corridor connects to the hospital's internal service network. It runs behind the recovery wing and branches toward central supply and the back stairwells." She'd learned this the hard way during her second year at Harlow County when a supply cart had gone missing, and she'd spent 40 minutes tracing it through the service corridors with a maintenance worker who knew every branch and turn of the building's back architecture. There are 4 exit points, 2 to the main building, 1 to the loading area, 1 to the parking structure. "Parking structure," Callahan said. "Yes." He made 2 calls in under a minute. Then he looked at Torres and said something Nora didn't fully catch. And Torres went to the secondary door and opened it with the careful, committed movement of someone who has cleared rooms before and is doing the full calculation even when there's probably no one immediately on the other side. The corridor beyond was empty, fluorescent, narrow, smelling of cleaning solution and old concrete. Torres went in, weapon drawn, and cleared the first section with the systematic efficiency of someone doing a job, not performing one. Callahan turned back to Nora. "The pump adjustment. How long before it would have shown clinical effect?" "Subtherapeutic delivery over 4 to 6 hours would compromise his antibiotic coverage and risk the infection rebounding. It wouldn't have been immediately obvious unless someone was checking his labs." She paused. "It was subtle enough to look like a pump malfunction. If I hadn't been actively monitoring, it would have looked like a post-surgical complication," Callahan said. "Yes." The word sat in the room, and neither of them said what it meant, which was that the approach had been medical, which meant the people who'd sent the 2 in scrubs had thought through the clinical architecture of how to hurt someone in a hospital without it looking like murder. That required a specific kind of knowledge and a specific kind of patience. Marcus was listening to all of this with his eyes open and his face doing nothing. "How many people know my testimony is scheduled?" he asked. Not to Callahan specifically. To the room. Callahan looked at him directly. "The list is supposed to be restricted. We're looking at how it wasn't." "Someone on the inside?" "Possibly." "Not possibly," Marcus said. Look at how precise this was. The scrubs, the service corridors, the pump adjustment instead of something obvious." He shifted slightly, controlled the wince that followed. "Someone gave them a map. Building layout, access points, clinical protocols." Callahan didn't argue with it. "Then you have a problem that's larger than this hospital," Marcus said. "We know that," Callahan said. "Does the committee know that?" Callahan was quiet for a moment. "They will after today." The next hour moved in the way that hours move, when the event horizon has already been crossed, and everything happening is consequence rather than cause, fast in some moments, strangely suspended in others, with the particular quality of aftermath that settles over a space where something nearly happened and didn't. Torres's sweep of the service corridor turned up nothing in the corridor itself, but at the third junction point, the branch toward the parking structure exit, She found a Harlow County scrub top folded and left on a supply shelf, which was precise and contemptuous in equal measure. The gesture of someone saying we were here and we left on our own terms. The people in the scrubs had exited before Callahan's team closed the parking structure exits, which meant the timing had been tight, and they'd known it and moved accordingly. They were gone. The building was now clear as far as anyone could determine, but as far as anyone could determine was not the same as confirmed clear, and everyone in Recovery Room C understood the difference. Callahan's backup arrived at 7:15, not the 2-hour timeline he'd projected, but closer to 90 minutes, which meant someone had pushed the deployment order harder than standard, and which arrived in the form of 4 additional people, 2 vehicles, and a set of communications equipment that changed the operational posture of the room significantly. Harlow County Medical Center's administrator on duty, not Sandra Kioff, who had gone home at 6, but a night administrator named Reeves, who had been briefed by someone above Sandra's pay grade, came to the recovery wing at 7:30 and stood in the doorway of Recovery Room C looking at the equipment and the people and the dog with the expression of a man who had agreed to something in the abstract and was now experiencing it concretely. "We need to discuss the logistics of," he started. "We'll have a full brief in 20 minutes, Callahan said. "Mr. Reeves, my team needs another hour in this wing before we can assess transport readiness." He said it with the particular authority of someone who is not in the habit of asking institutions for permission and is framing a directive as a collaboration, as a professional courtesy. Reeves received it accordingly and retreated. Nora, who had no official standing in Recovery Room C as of 6:47, when Hart had formally processed her suspension and sent the paperwork to HR, was still in Recovery Room C because no one had specifically and physically removed her, and because Remy would not leave the room and Remy's management was a practical problem that nobody else had the skill set to address. She had accepted that she was operating in a gray area and had decided it was the right gray area to be in. Pavel Dowd, the nurse to whom Marcus's care had been officially reassigned, had appeared at the recovery wing at 6:55, assessed the room, assessed Remy, assessed Nora, and said, with the pragmatic honesty of a competent professional who is not interested in being a casualty of someone else's administrative dispute, "Just tell me if his numbers go somewhere they shouldn't." "I will," she'd said. They had achieved a functional working arrangement from a distance of approximately 6 feet, which was not conventional and was also the best available option. At 8:15, the piece of the day that Nora had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it finally arrived. It arrived in the form of a woman she didn't recognize, late 40s, civilian clothes, the specific composure of someone who operates in environments where composure is professional currency, who came into Recovery Room C with Callahan and introduced herself as Agent Danielle Price, Federal Oversight. "The committee moved the timeline up," Price said, addressing Marcus. "Given the events of today, they want a preliminary statement tonight. Secured line, not in person. I have the equipment." She looked at Nora briefly. "I need the room." "She stays," Marcus said. A pause. "Mr. Garrett, she stays," he said again. The same 2 words, the same flat tone, with the specific quality of a statement that is not the beginning of a negotiation. Price looked at Callahan. Callahan looked at Nora with an expression she couldn't fully read. "She has relevant background," he said, "and she's been managing the patient's care continuity under difficult circumstances. The committee can make a formal objection to her presence in the statement record if they choose." Price considered this for approximately 4 seconds. "Fine," she said, and set up her equipment. What Marcus told the committee's representative over the next 45 minutes was not something Nora was supposed to hear, and she was aware of that, and she understood that her presence in the room placed her in a category of witness that had specific legal implications she hadn't fully thought through. She stayed anyway. She stayed because Marcus had said she stays in that specific tone, and because Remy's head was in her lap, and because she was beginning to understand that she had been brought back into the current of something she'd left deliberately 3 years ago. Not by accident, not by Callahan's appearance, but by the specific and irreducible fact of who she was and what she was capable of, which had been true before she'd walked into Harlow County Medical Center on her first shift and would be true after she walked out. What Marcus had witnessed 11 months ago was a meeting. A specific meeting in a specific location between people whose names Nora didn't recognize but whose titles she did, in which decisions had been made about military contracting that had resulted in equipment failures in the field, and in which those failures and the casualties that followed had been deliberately reclassified to prevent accountability. He had been there by accident, cleared for a different briefing in an adjacent space, and had seen and heard things that had not been intended for him. He had understood immediately what he was dealing with and had done the only thing that made sense, which was to disappear until he could surface somewhere the information could reach the right channel without being intercepted first. He had been carrying it for 11 months, alone, with a dog named Remy, who was her handler's daughter, and who had apparently been the only constant in 11 months of sustained isolation. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Price looked at her equipment, made some notations, and said, "We'll need a full deposition at the secured facility. The preliminary statement creates the formal record that protects you while we arrange transport." "How soon?" Marcus asked. 48 hours. We move you tonight to an interim secure location. Deposition happens day after tomorrow. And the people who were in this building today. Price's expression didn't change. Being processed. The man from the corridor is talking. The vehicle occupants from the parking structure were detained by local law enforcement in coordination with our office. The individuals in the service corridors are, a slight pause, still being located. "They're not in Denton Ridge anymore," Marcus said. "No," Price agreed. "Probably not." "And the inside person, the one who gave them the building layout and the committee schedule." Price looked at him steadily. "We have a lead." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have tonight," she said, with the honest flatness of someone who is not going to perform certainty she doesn't have. Marcus looked at the ceiling. "Okay," he said. The administrative machinery of what came next moved faster than Nora expected, and in a direction she had not fully anticipated. At 9 o'clock, Reeves called a staff meeting in the main conference room, which was unusual at that hour, and which resulted in the night shift and several of the day shift staff who hadn't left yet, gathering in a room that was slightly too small for the number of people now in it. Callahan and Price were both present. Hart was present, having been called back in, and he stood near the door with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who is beginning to understand that the day has not gone in the direction he thought it was going. What Callahan told the assembled staff was limited but specific, that Marcus Garrett was a protected federal witness, that the hospital had been the site of an attempted interference with that protection, that the interference had been unsuccessful, and that an investigation was now open into how access to the hospital's internal systems, building schematics, and staff resources had been obtained by outside parties. The word inside did not appear in what Callahan said. It didn't need to. The room processed this in the way rooms process information that reconfigures the shape of a day they thought they understood, with a specific kind of silence that is not absence of sound, but compression of reaction, everyone doing their accounting privately before the group exhales. Then Callahan said, "I also want to address the actions of a member of your nursing staff today." Nora, who was standing near the back of the room because she was suspended and technically shouldn't have been in the meeting at all and had positioned herself accordingly, went still. Nora Voss responded to the initial incident in your ER this morning with a level of situational competence that directly prevented the escalation of a dangerous encounter. Her management of the patient's care and the patient's animal throughout the day was the primary reason we were able to maintain stability in this facility during an active security situation. And her identification of an unauthorized entry point and provision of critical building layout information to my team materially contributed to the safety of everyone in this hospital tonight. The room was very quiet. Hart had unfolded his arms. "I want to be clear," Callahan said, "that the information I've received about her conduct today reflects a standard of professional judgment that I would have expected from a trained operator in the field, not a civilian facility." He paused. She knew what she was dealing with. At every decision point, she made the right call. Nora was aware of people turning to look at her in the way people turn when a name is spoken in a room. She kept her face neutral and her posture even. Sandra Keough, who had apparently also been called back in and was standing near the front of the room, turned and looked at her with an expression that was not quite an apology. Sandra Keough was not the kind of person who expressed apology quickly or publicly, but was something adjacent to it. A recognition. The specific look of someone who has made a judgment with the information they had and is now holding that judgment next to the information they didn't have and doing the math honestly. Hart did not turn around. But the meeting ended at 9:40. People dispersed. The hallways resumed their usual rhythms, or as close to usual as a hospital can manage at 10 o'clock on a night when federal agents have spent several hours in it. Nora was in the corridor near the conference room when Sandra Keogh caught her. "The suspension notice," Sandra said. "I'm rescinding it." "In writing?" "Yes." "Including the documentation of the timeline I asked for." A pause. "Yes, including that." Nora looked at her. Sandra was not comfortable. She was not supposed to be comfortable. "How soon?" Nora asked. "Tonight. I'll have it to HR before I leave." "Okay," Nora said. Sandra started to say something else and then didn't, which was probably the honest choice, and walked away. Nora went back to the recovery wing. Hart was in the corridor outside Recovery Room C when she got there. Not waiting for her specifically, or if he was, he'd positioned himself to make it look like he wasn't, standing with his arms at his sides and his face doing the work of someone who is constructing something and hasn't finished yet. She stopped 6 feet from him because that was where the corridor was, and because she was done engineering distances tonight. He looked at her for a moment. "The dog," he said. "This morning. You knew what you were doing." "Yes." "And the command you used." "Yes." He was quiet for another moment. Hart was not a man who apologized easily. She'd known that from her first month at Harlow County, watched him navigate mistakes with the particular defensiveness of someone whose sense of professional identity doesn't have much flex in it. He wasn't going to apologize now, and she wasn't waiting for it. "The patient's stats have been stable since 7, he said. Dowd flagged a slight elevation in his heart rate at 8:30. I reviewed it. It resolved." "I know, I saw the update." Another pause. "Your clinical instincts today were not wrong," he said. "It came out carefully, like something that had been worked on. I want that to be on the record." "Put it in writing," she said. "That's all I ask." He nodded once, and she moved past him into the recovery wing. Marcus was awake and had been allowed to sit up slightly. Ariez had come in at 9 and adjusted his position with the firm, unsentimental care of a surgeon who is monitoring her own work and wants a specific angle of observation on it. His color was better. The IV was running correctly. Remy was at his side with her head on the mattress, eyes open, tracking Nora as she came in. "I heard some of what Callahan said," Marcus said. "The door was open." "Then you know." "I know what he said." He looked at her. "I don't know what you did before this place. What you told Callahan, what you told Price. Your actual story." "My actual story is sealed," she said. "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not asking for the classified version." She pulled the chair from the corner of the room and sat in it, close enough to the bed that she could see his monitor readings without leaning. Remy shifted to lay partly across her feet, which was the dog's version of claiming a position. "I was a combat medic," she said, "attached to special operations for 4 years. The last year and a half of that was in a context that required the service record to be sealed when I left." She paused. "I left because of injuries. Not the kind that show on a scan, the other kind. The ones that take a while to add up to a number you can't ignore." "I know that kind," he said. "I imagine you do." She looked at the monitor. His heart rate was steady. "I came to Harlow County because I needed somewhere that felt contained. Manageable. Where the emergencies were car accidents and chest pain and people who needed care that I could actually provide and then go home from." She looked at him. "I was good at it. I am good at it. It's a real job, and it's the job I chose. And today was different. Different because of me. Different because of the situation." She corrected it without emphasis because it needed to be accurate. "You were the patient. The situation was what it was." He looked at her with the careful attention he'd been looking at her with all day. "Callahan wants to offer you a re-engagement," he said. She went still. "He told me before Price arrived, said the way you operated today identified a capability gap in their civilian liaison structure." Marcus's voice was flat, factual. "He'll approach you formally. I wanted you to know it was coming." She was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "That it wasn't my place to speak for you." "That's right," she said. It's not. But I'm telling you anyway, he said, because you should have the full information when he asks. Not a surprise in a hallway. She sat with it. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. Somewhere in the hospital, a door closed, and the sound traveled through the building's bones and arrived in the room quiet and impersonal. I need to check your wound site, she said. Okay, he said. She did it carefully, gloves on, the dressing peeled back in the specific way that minimizes disruption to the underlying tissue, the wound examined under the room's clinical light with the attention it had been earning all day. The surgical closure was holding. The inflammation margins were not expanding. The antibiotics were doing their job. She redressed it and stepped back. It looks good, she said. Better than I expected, given the day. He almost smiled again. It almost landed the same way it had that morning, trying and not quite making it, the smile of someone who has been alone for 11 months and has slightly lost the habit. Nora, he said. She looked at him. Thank you. He said it the way he said everything, directly, without decoration. For Remy. For the rest of it. You're my patient, she said. That's the job. I know, he said. Thank you anyway. She picked up the chart from the foot of his bed, made the final note for the night, set it back down. She was at the door when he said, the person who gave them the building layout. She stopped. Price said they had a lead. That's investigator language for we know, and we're building the case. He paused. Someone who works in this building. Someone who had access to the physical layout, the clinical protocols, the administrative systems. I know, she said. It's someone who knew you were here, he said. Someone who knew what you knew and what you were capable of. Because the approach today, the precision of it, targeting the IV line, targeting the pump settings, wasn't just about reaching me. It was designed to look like a failure in my care, a clinical error. He held her gaze. Whoever designed that understood exactly how this ER operates and who in it to route around. The corridor outside the door was lit and empty. Nora stood in the doorway and thought about Hart saying, I pulled your file. Thought about him standing in the corridor at 9:45, carefully choosing words. Thought about Sandra Keogh's expression in the conference room. Not quite apology, but something. Recalibration. Thought about who had been in this building all day, who had had access to everything, who had known about her background and had made very specific decisions about how to use that knowledge, not to protect Marcus, but to move her out of position. The administrative suspension, the reassignment of the case to Dowd. The sequence that would have left Marcus without his most effective clinical advocate at precisely the window when someone had adjusted his IV pump. She turned and looked at Marcus. His eyes were steady on her face. I know, she said. I've known for about an hour. And the expression on his face shifted. Not surprise, but the specific sober acknowledgement of a person who has confirmed something they hoped was wrong. Then you know what it means, he said. It means it's not over, she said. Not even close. She stepped into the corridor and pulled the door behind her, and in the quiet of the recovery wing's empty hallway, she stood alone for one moment and let herself understand the full weight of what she was now standing inside of. Not as a nurse managing a patient, not as a suspended employee with a rescinded notice in her pocket, but as someone who had walked back into something that had never actually let go of her, and who was now going to have to decide what she was willing to do about it. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. No name, no prefix. 4 words, and a hospital personnel photo she'd seen before in a different context. In an HR file, in the background of a staff meeting, in the peripheral vision of 1,000 ordinary workdays. The photo was of someone she knew. The 4 words were, he's already been moved. She looked at the photo for 3 seconds, which was enough. The face in it was Dr. Philip Hart, not a candid, a formal staff photo, the kind taken at the beginning of employment and updated every few years, the kind that lives in HR databases and internal directories and the administrative systems of a hospital that had, at some point in the last several months, been accessed by someone who knew exactly where to look. The text had come from a number she didn't recognize, which meant either an ally she hadn't identified or a warning from someone who was watching the situation from a distance she couldn't calculate. He's already been moved. She read it again, past tense. Already. She went through the door of Recovery Room C. Marcus looked at her face and sat up straighter, which cost him, and she didn't tell him to stop. Hart, she said. Where does Callahan have him? I don't know that Callahan has him. The text says he's already been moved. She showed him the screen. He looked at it with the focused attention of someone reading a grid reference, not a message. If Callahan moved him before telling me, there's a reason. If someone else moved him, then we have a different problem, Marcus said. She was already dialing Callahan. He picked up on the second ring. I was about to call you, he said. The text. You got it too. A pause, which, in Callahan's communication style, meant he was making a rapid decision about how much to say and in what order. Hart is in custody. Federal, not local. Price's people took him 40 minutes ago, quietly, from the parking lot. He was making a call on a second phone when they reached him. The corridor outside the room was still empty, still quiet. You knew, she said. We confirmed it at 9:15. The inside access, the building schematics, the committee timeline, the staff rotation data, it came through an administrative account that Hart had legitimate access to as senior attending. He'd been feeding information for approximately 3 weeks. The scrubs the two in the corridor were wearing came from a supply requisition he'd flagged as a training exercise. She stood with it. The suspension, she said, moving me off the case. Designed to create a gap in Marcus's clinical coverage during the window they needed. Callahan's voice was even. We think the plan was for the pump adjustment to look like a post-surgical complication, subtherapeutic antibiotics, fever spike, clinical deterioration that would require intervention and create a transport delay, which would have extended the window significantly. And if I hadn't reset the pump? The outcome would have been different, he said, not elaborating, not needing to. She looked at Marcus, who was listening with his head slightly forward, the posture of someone who has stopped expending energy on managing pain and is putting everything into processing. What happens to him? She asked. Federal charges. Conspiracy, obstruction of a federal proceeding, and whatever the prosecutor's office adds once they finish going through his second phone. A brief pause. It's not going to be a short process, but it started, and the record is established, and he's not walking out of it. Does Sandra know? She was briefed 10 minutes ago by Reeves. She's handling it. Okay, Nora said. The text you received, Callahan said. I didn't send it. I know, the number isn't yours. We're tracing it. My working assumption is that someone on Price's team sent it independently. They've been running a parallel watch on your phone activity because of your proximity to the case. Whether that was authorized or not is a conversation for tomorrow. Someone wanted to make sure I knew, she said. Yes, Callahan said. I think that's right. She ended the call, stood in the room with Marcus and Remy and the steady beeping of monitors that were, finally, reading normally. It's Hart, she said. Marcus closed his eyes for 1 second, opened them. How deep? Deep enough for federal charges. She set her phone on the chair beside the bed. 3 weeks of access. The scrubs, the building layout, the committee schedule. And the people he was feeding it to. They have his phone. He nodded slowly. Then the testimony holds, he said. Whatever they were trying to prevent, it holds. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. The quality of his silence was different from earlier. Not the compressed, effortful silence of someone managing pain and information simultaneously, but something that had more space in it, something approaching the beginning of rest. 11 months, he said, not to her specifically. I know. I kept thinking... He stopped, shook his head. I kept thinking that carrying it alone was the only way to keep it intact, that every person who knew was another variable. It's a reasonable calculation, she said. In the field. In the field, he agreed, but it's a bad way to live. He looked at her. You know that. That's why you came here. I came here because I needed to stop, she said honestly. It wasn't a strategy. I was used up. I needed somewhere that had edges I could see. Did it work? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which was more than she'd usually give it. Some days, she said. Most days, actually. For a long time, most days. And today. Today was today, she said. Today was its own thing. Remy lifted her head from the mattress and looked at Nora with the calm, unhurried attention of an animal that has been paying close attention all day and has arrived at some conclusion that she's not sharing. Nora reached over and scratched behind her ear, and the dog leaned into it with a heaviness that was pure exhaustion finally given permission to exist. "Sleep," Nora told Marcus. This time, he didn't argue. She stayed in the recovery wing until midnight. Not in his room, she moved through the corridor, checked in with Dowd twice, monitored the equipment readings from the nurse's station, and drank a cup of terrible coffee that someone had left in the recovery wing's small break alcove at some point during the evening, and that tasted like it had been brewed during a different shift entirely. At midnight, she went home. She drove the 12 minutes to her apartment in the specific state of tiredness that is past the point of feeling tired, and has become something more ambient, more fundamental. The fatigue of a day that has moved through more registers than any single day is designed to hold. She showered. She ate crackers and a piece of cheese because there was nothing else, and she couldn't have cooked if there had been. She sat at her kitchen table for 20 minutes doing nothing in particular, just existing in a space that was hers and quiet and entirely without urgency. Then she went to bed, and for the first time in a long time, she was asleep before she'd finished the thought she'd started. She was back at 6:45, same parking space, same entrance, same coffee from the same machine that had not improved overnight. She clocked in, pulled the board, and started moving. Pavel Dowd was finishing his shift and met her in the handoff corridor with Marcus's overnight notes. Stable vitals, 1 pain management adjustment at 3 a.m. Remy having apparently maintained her bedside position for the entirety of the night without incident. "Dog never moved," Dowd said. "I checked in at 2, and she was exactly where she'd been at 10. I think she slept with one eye open." "That's accurate for the breed," Nora said. Dowd handed her the chart. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that sat somewhere between respect and relief. The expression of someone who had been handed a complicated situation and been told that the person who actually knew how to navigate it was coming back in the morning. "Good luck today," he said, and meant it. The morning was ordinary in the specific way that mornings after extraordinary days can be. Not actually ordinary, but performing it. The hospital doing what hospitals do, which is prioritize the immediate and let the previous day become background, something to process later when there's time, which there never quite is. Sandra Keogh found her at 8. The rescinding documentation was in writing. All of it, formatted correctly, with the timeline Nora had asked for and Sandra's signature at the bottom, and a note that the administrative oversight action was being removed from Nora's personnel file. Sandra handed it to her in a manila folder, which was a formality that Nora recognized as Sandra's way of communicating that it was real and documented, and not just a verbal correction. "The board reviewed the situation last night," Sandra said. "Given the full picture." "Okay," Nora said. "There will be an internal review of Dr. Hart's access privileges and the administrative systems he had access to over the past several months. Compliance will be running it. You may be asked to provide a statement." "I will." Sandra looked at her. "Nora." She said it carefully, the way she'd said everything this morning, with a deliberateness that communicated she'd been thinking about what words to use. "The decision I made yesterday, the oversight, the reassignment, I made it with the information I had, and I want to be honest that the information I had was shaped by what Hart told me." "I know that," Nora said. "He came to me at 2:30 and told me you were operating erratically, that your background was unverified and your judgment was compromised by a personal connection to the patient." Sandra's jaw tightened. "I didn't verify his account before acting on it." "No," Nora said. "I should have." "Yes," Nora said. "You should have." The honesty of it sat between them. Sandra received it without deflecting, which cost her something, and which Nora noted. "It won't happen again," Sandra said. "I believe you," Nora said. And she did, actually. Not because the situation demanded graciousness, but because she'd watched Sandra Keogh operate for 3 years and understood that the woman's flaws were specific. She moved fast. She trusted institutional hierarchy too much. She sometimes chose order over judgment, and that those flaws were, today, fully visible to their owner. That was worth something. She put the folder in her locker and went back to work. Callahan came at 10:30 with Price, and they came together and without the military formality of the night before, which Nora read correctly as a shift in the nature of what this conversation was going to be. They found her in the east corridor where she was coming out of a patient room. They fell into step beside her, and the three of them moved to the consultation room at the end of the hall, The same room where Callahan had first briefed her the morning before, which now felt like a different version of the same geography. Hart gave a preliminary statement this morning, Price said, once the door was closed. He's cooperating. He's been cooperating since approximately 4 a.m., when his attorney apparently informed him of the weight of what they found on the second phone. What was on it? Nora asked. 11 weeks of communications with a private contractor who was operating on behalf of two of the individuals named in Garrett's testimony. Money transfers, access credentials, operational schedules. Price's voice was matter-of-fact. He was paid. Not a huge amount, which will probably bother him more as time goes on. He was also given, and this is relevant, a specific profile of this hospital's personnel. Who knew what? Who could be maneuvered? Who might be a problem? My background, Nora said. They knew you'd left the service. They didn't know the full scope of what you'd done. That file is genuinely sealed, and they didn't have the access level to open it. But they knew enough to identify you as someone who might recognize what was happening and act on it. Price paused. Hart's instructions were to neutralize your involvement before you became a variable they couldn't control. The clinical neutrality of the phrase, neutralize your involvement, had a particular quality when applied to your own life. She sat with it for a moment. He almost managed it, she said. He didn't, Price said, because I reset a pump setting and happened to know what Remy's raised hackles meant. She looked at Price. It wasn't strategy, it was proximity. A lot of outcomes come down to proximity, Price said. Who happens to be in the room? What they happen to know? She held Nora's gaze. In this case, the right person was in the room. That matters, regardless of how it got that way. Callahan had been quiet, which was his pattern when he was waiting to say something he considered important enough to hold for the right moment. The re-engagement, he said now. I heard it was coming, she said. A slight look at Marcus's direction, or the direction of the recovery wing, that he controlled quickly. He told you. He wanted me to have the full information. He was right to. Callahan nodded once. The formal offer will come through the appropriate channels with the appropriate paperwork. I'm not asking you to decide anything today. He paused. But I want to say something that isn't in the formal offer. She waited. What you did yesterday, the moment in the ER with the dog, the way you managed the security situation, the pump, the text, the building layout, none of that was because you were following a protocol. It was because you know how to read a situation and you stayed inside it when most people would have stepped back. He looked at her steadily. That's not a skill set we manufacture. That's what someone becomes after years of carrying something hard without letting it hollow them out. He paused. We need people who are still themselves after everything. That's harder to find than you might think. Nora was quiet for a moment. I'll look at the paperwork, she said. That's all I'm asking, he said. She was in recovery room C at 11:15, and the quality of the light through the frosted window was different from the previous day. Cleaner, more direct, the angle of late morning sun rather than the orange compression of approaching evening. Marcus was sitting up properly, which Adaez had approved at the 8 o'clock check. His color had improved significantly. He still moved with the careful economy of someone managing surgical pain, but the fog of the previous day's anesthesia and stress was gone from his eyes, and what remained was simply him, clear and direct and tired in the specific way of someone who has been carrying something for 11 months and has, in the last 12 hours, put some portion of it down. You came back, he said. I work here, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. This time it landed. She checked his wound, which was holding well. She checked his vitals, which were where they should be. She reviewed the antibiotic delivery log, which was correct, and the pain management notes, which were adequate, and she made 2 small adjustments to his care plan that she documented with the same detailed precision she'd used for everything the previous day, because the record was the record, and it needed to tell the true story of what had happened in this room. Remy watched all of it from the floor beside the bed, with the quiet surveillance of an animal who has decided that the person performing these actions is trustworthy and is confirming that decision on an ongoing basis. Price told me about Hart, Marcus said. She was here? 8 o'clock. She briefed me on the charges. The phone. He paused. The money. How do you feel about it? He considered the question honestly. I don't feel good about it, he said. I feel like it's the right outcome, but it doesn't fix anything that got broken. He looked at his hands. People made decisions because he gave them information. Those decisions had operational consequences that I know about and that will come out in the deposition. The accountability goes further than him. I know, she said. The deposition is tomorrow at 1400. He looked up. They're moving me tonight once Adayez clears the transport. There's a secure facility 40 miles north. He paused. Remy goes with me. She should, Nora said. After the deposition, the formal proceedings will take months, maybe longer. But the record is established now. Price said it this morning. Whatever they try to do to slow it down, the record exists. That's what you stayed alive to build, she said. Yes. He said it simply. That's what it was for. She made the final notation on his chart. She was capping her pen when he said her name. Not Voss, not Nurse Voss, just Nora, the way he'd been saying it since the previous morning. The way that had started as a practical identification and had become something more specific over the course of 16 hours. She looked at him. The re-engagement offer, he said. Callahan mentioned it last night. He'll mention it again with more paperwork. He already did. Are you going to take it? She stood for a moment with the question. Outside the frosted window, Denton Ridge continued to exist in the way that mid-sized Colorado cities exist, without urgency, without drama, in the particular register of a place where people live and work and drive their kids to school and have ordinary Tuesdays that don't become anything other than what they appeared to be at the start. She had chosen this. She had chosen it for real reasons that were still real. I don't know yet, she said. I'm going to look at the paperwork and think about it. That's a real answer, he said. It's the only one I have. He nodded. He looked at the window. He looked back at her. Whatever you decide, he said. What you did yesterday. The clinical part. The management of the situation. All of it. You were operating at a level that this place doesn't know what to do with. He said it carefully, not as a judgment of the hospital, but as a statement of observable fact. I'm not saying that to push you toward anything. I'm saying it because I think you know it, and I think you don't always let yourself know it. She thought about that. About walking into this hospital 3 years ago with her discharge paperwork and her nursing credentials and the deliberate intention of being exactly what she appeared to be, a capable, reserved ER nurse who kept to herself and did her job well and went home at the end of her shift and didn't carry anything back out into the world that she'd carried in from somewhere else. She had been that. She had been that genuinely, and she had also been, always, the person who had walked into a war zone at 23 and stayed for 4 years and learned things that you don't unlearn, and who had sat for 2 weeks in a field hospital speaking softly to an injured dog in a language she'd had to be taught one word at a time, because the animal needed someone to stay with her and Nora was the person who was there. Those things were not in conflict. That had taken her a long time to understand, and she still didn't always understand it on a visceral level, but she understood it today, in this specific room, with Remy's warm weight settled against her foot, and Marcus's clear eyes across the space between them. I know it, she said. Most days. He was transferred at 7:15 that evening. Arez cleared the transport with conditions, specific monitoring requirements for the vehicle, a 2-hour observation window before departure, a detailed handoff document that Nora helped write because she knew his case better than anyone, and the handoff needed to be right. She was not supposed to be involved in the transport preparation because she was not the case nurse of record, and she did it anyway with Dowd's consent and Adiezi's tacit approval because the record needed to be right and she was the person who knew how to make it right. She was in the corridor when they brought him out. He was in a wheelchair, Adiezi's requirement, non-negotiable, and he moved into it with the particular gracelessness of a large man who is accustomed to walking under his own power and finds the chair offensive, which she found unexpectedly human, and which she filed alongside everything else from the last 36 hours in the part of her that would be processing this for a while. Remy walked beside the wheelchair. At the corridor junction, Marcus looked up and found her, and they looked at each other for a moment that didn't need anything added to it. No summary, no sentiment, no attempt to resolve in language what the previous day had been, because some things resist that kind of resolution and are more honestly left as what they are, which is experience. Which is two people who moved through something hard and came out the other side still standing, changed in ways they couldn't fully inventory yet. Take care of yourself, she said. You too, he said. Remy turned and looked at her directly as the wheelchair began to move, the dog's full attention, the specific and focused regard of an animal that has made a determination about a person and is registering its departure. Then the dog turned and walked beside Marcus, and they went around the corner, and the corridor was empty. 3 weeks later, the federal proceedings entered their public phase. The charges filed against the private contractor connected to Hart's communications were reported in 3 national outlets and covered in significantly more detail by the investigative journalist who had been tracking the military contracting story for months from a different angle and who now had, courtesy of a sealed proceeding that was less sealed than intended, enough to build something substantial. The names of the 2 senior figures named in Marcus's testimony were not released publicly but were confirmed, in the particular language of federal proceedings, to be subjects of ongoing investigation. Hart was formally charged on a Thursday. The charges were filed in federal court and the filing was public record. Conspiracy to obstruct federal proceedings, unauthorized disclosure of protected personnel information, and 3 counts related to the financial transfers on the second phone. He entered a plea through his attorney and was released on conditions that included the surrender of his medical license pending the outcome of the case. The medical license surrender was what the hospital's staff talked about. Not the federal charges, those were large and abstract, but the license, which was concrete and specific, and meant that the man who had stood in the ER for 11 years telling people what to do was not going to be doing it anymore. There was no satisfaction in the room when people discussed it. There was something more complicated, the specific discomfort of discovering that someone you've trusted with consequential decisions was operating in a register you didn't have access to, and the unsettling work of reassessing everything they touched. Nora didn't participate in those conversations. Not because she felt protective of Hart, she didn't, but because she understood that the work of the hospital needed to continue and that the people doing it needed to recalibrate without her opinion, making the process harder than it was already going to be. She did her job. She showed up at 6:45. She drank the bad coffee. She moved through her cases with the competence she'd always had and the specific additional weight of someone who has recently been reminded, concretely, of what she's actually carrying. She was, in the assessment of everyone who worked alongside her, exactly the same as she had always been. They were right. She was. She was also, in ways that would take longer to surface, different in ways she hadn't finished understanding yet. She looked at Callahan's paperwork on a Sunday morning, at her kitchen table, with coffee that was better than the hospital's and pale light coming through the window over the sink. The formal offer was what he'd described: a civilian liaison structure, advisory capacity, flexible engagement that didn't require her to leave Denton Ridge, or stop being a nurse, or become anything other than what she was. It was careful paperwork, written by people who understood that the thing they were asking for couldn't be compelled and needed to be chosen. She read it twice. She sat with it for a while. She thought about Danny Reyes, who had talked about her to Marcus without knowing her name. She thought about Remy, whose lineage ran back to a dog she'd sat with for 2 weeks in a field hospital because sitting with her had been the right thing to do, and Nora had been the person there to do it. She thought about Marcus's 11 months alone with information that mattered, and what it had cost him, and what it had cost the people whose names were in those proceedings. She thought about the pump, the 3-degree adjustment that would have looked like a malfunction, the gap in coverage that had been manufactured specifically to exploit the space between what she was supposed to be and what she actually was. She had spent 3 years trying to make those 2 things the same thing, to be fully and only the person she appeared to be. And she had done it, genuinely. She had been a nurse. She had been a good nurse. That was real. But the gap was also real. And leaving it empty didn't make it safe. It just left it available for other people to use. She picked up her pen. She didn't sign the paperwork that morning. She made notes in the margins, questions, conditions, specific points she wanted addressed before she committed to anything. She was not going to say yes without understanding what yes meant, and she was not going to say yes in a way that required her to become something other than what she'd built here, which had cost her something to build and was worth protecting. But she was going to respond. She was going to engage with it honestly, with her eyes open, with the full weight of everything she'd understood about herself in the last 3 weeks. That was not the same as surrender. It was the opposite. The following Tuesday, she was treating a 44-year-old with a suspected broken wrist in Bay 3 when the department doors opened and she heard the sound she'd been not quite expecting for 3 weeks. Pause on linoleum, specific and unhurried. She looked up. Marcus was walking under his own power, which she noted with the clinical satisfaction of someone who had been monitoring his recovery from a distance through the handoff documentation. He was still moving carefully, still carrying the leg with the particular awareness of a person who has been reminded recently of its existence. But he was upright, and he was moving, and his face had the specific quality of someone who has slept, consecutively, for more than 4 hours. Remy walked beside him and found Nora before Marcus had fully oriented himself, covering the distance with the same directional certainty she'd shown the first day, knowing before knowing, choosing before being asked. The dog put her head against Nora's leg. Nora rested her hand on Remy's head for one moment, just one, and looked up at Marcus. "You're supposed to be at a secured facility," she said. "I was released this morning." He stopped 6 feet away. "The preliminary proceedings concluded yesterday. The formal record is established and the committee has what it needs. He paused. "I'm not cleared for regular life yet, but I'm no longer required to stay in a controlled location." "How's the wound?" "The facility's physician says it's responding well. I have a follow-up appointment in 2 weeks." He looked at her steadily. "I wanted to come here first." She looked at him. He looked at her. Remy leaned slightly heavier against her leg. "Why?" she said. "Because this is where it started," he said, "and because there are things I should have said more clearly when I had the chance." He paused. "And because Remy wouldn't stop looking at the door of the van for the last 40 miles. She looked down at the dog, who looked back at her with the uncomplicated candor of an animal that is not going to pretend that what it feels is less than what it is. "Are you in pain right now?" she asked Marcus. "A 4, he said. "That's manageable." "I know how to manage it. I know you do." She looked at him. "Come sit down." They went to the small waiting area near the east corridor. Not a bay, not a consultation room, just the chairs that lived in the corner of the department for patients who were mobile enough to wait upright. Remy settled between them on the floor with the definitive placement of a dog who has decided where she is going to be. "The deposition," she said, "went for 6 hours, 2 days." He said it with the flatness of someone describing something that was difficult and is now behind them. "The committee has the full account, the contractor's cooperation, Hart's cooperation, the phone records. It's enough. The people named in it won't be able to stop what happens next, even if they have the resources to slow it down. And the people who came into this hospital. The 3 who were detained are cooperating under federal immunity agreements. The 2 who got out through the service corridors were located in New Mexico 4 days ago. They're in custody." He looked at his hands. "It's not clean. It never is. But the structure of accountability is in place, and the people who built that structure, the people who were supposed to be protecting the process, have been identified." A pause. "Including Hart. His license hearing is next month," she said. "I heard." He looked at her directly. "How are you?" The question was simple and serious and deserved the same treatment. "I'm okay," she said. "I'm still processing some of it. The Hart part specifically. I worked next to him for 3 years." "I know. I missed it. Whatever was happening with him, whatever combination of debt or compromise or something I don't have the full picture of, I didn't see it." "You weren't supposed to," Marcus said. "That's what compartmentalization is designed to do. It's not a failure of observation. It's the design of the thing." "I know that," she said. "I still missed it." "Yes," he said, without consolation, because she didn't need consolation. She needed the honest acknowledgement that what she'd said was true and that true things were worth sitting with rather than immediately resolving. So did a lot of other people. The difference is that when it mattered, you were in the right position to respond. She was quiet for a moment. In the bay behind them, the patient with the broken wrist was being taken for imaging. The department moved through its morning with the rhythm she'd learned to find grounding in, the specific, unromantic rhythm of care, of people showing up to the problem of other people's pain with whatever they had and doing the work. "Callahan's paperwork," she said. Have you looked at it?" "I've looked at it. I'm working through it." She paused. "I'm not going to give up the nursing. Whatever I agree to, that stays." "I'd hope so," Marcus said. "You're good at it." "I'm good at both things," she said. It came out without hesitation, and what she felt when it did was not pride exactly, something quieter than pride. Something like accuracy, the specific satisfaction of saying a true thing that has taken a long time to be able to say without qualification. She had spent 3 years trying to be one thing because one thing felt safer, Felt like a life that had borders she could see and know and trust. And she understood why she'd needed that. She didn't regret it. But she was not only one thing, she had never been. The woman who sat for 2 weeks with an injured dog in a field hospital and learned every word of a language she didn't speak because the animal needed someone to stay. That woman had not disappeared when Nora Voss clocked in at Harlow County Medical Center. She had been here the whole time, showing up in the quality of attention she gave her patients, in the way she read a room before anyone else had finished walking into it, in the steadiness that other people experienced as reserve. And that was, in fact, something different. The steadiness of a person who has been in the worst rooms and knows that what helps is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move anyway. You cannot separate what you survive from what you become. You can try. You can try for years, with discipline and intention and every practical tool available. But the survival is in you, and it shapes you, and the question is never whether to carry it, you are already carrying it, but whether you're going to carry it toward something or just carry it. She had carried it into a hospital where people needed care. That had been right. She was going to keep doing that. Whatever else she decided, she was going to keep doing that. Marcus was watching her with the patient attention of a person who is comfortable with silence and understands that some thinking needs to be done rather than spoken. Remy had fallen asleep on the floor between them, her broad head resting on her paws, breathing slowly in the particular rhythm of a dog that has finally, fully let its guard down. Nora looked at her, looked at Marcus. "Thank you for coming back," she said. "I had an appointment with a diaze," he said. "That's not why you came back." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "it's not." She stood. She picked up her clipboard. Bay 3 needed a follow-up note, and the chest pain in Bay 7 needed a recheck, and the board showed 4 more patients waiting, and the day was moving in the direction days move, which is forward, which is the only direction available. "I'll be here for a while," Marcus said. "If that's... I have the follow-up appointment at noon." "I know," she said. "I'll find you on my break." She walked back into the department, and the work received her the way good work always does, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, with only the immediate and honest demand of the next thing that needed to be done. She did it. She did it well. And she did it as herself, all of it, the parts that were visible and the parts that were not, the nurse and the soldier and the woman who had survived enough to know that survival is not the final destination, but the starting condition, the ground you stand on when you decide what you're going to build. The quietest person in the room is sometimes the one who has already been through the fire and come back with the burns and kept showing up anyway. Not because they were unafraid, not because it was easy, not because anyone applauded, because showing up was what they knew how to do, and because the people in front of them needed someone who knew how. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can be is simply, stubbornly, irreducibly present, in the right place at the right time, with the right knowledge, and willing to use it.